All right, everyone, let's dive into shutter speed, the second element in controlling exposure. Your camera's shutter is a screen that is in front of the sensor. It opens and closes when you press the shutter release button. The amount of time that the shutter is open is called shutter speed. It is measured in seconds, but it can range from just a tiny fraction of a second to a few seconds or even 30 seconds. The range will vary depending on your camera, but what doesn't change is what it is. You are only allowing light into your camera for a set period of time, your shutter speed. The faster your shutter speed, the quicker it opens and closes, the less light that you're allowing into your camera. And of course, onto your image sensor. So then the slower your shutter speed, the more time between when that shutter opens and closes, the more light you're allowing in. What that actually looks like in the numbers is this. For a portrait or landscape image, you are almost always going to be choosing a shutter speed of much less than 1 second. So you'll choose something like 1/200th or 1/250th, maybe even faster, meaning a bigger number in the bottom of that fraction. Or a slower shutter speed, meaning a smaller number on the bottom of the fraction. Or for really long shutter speeds, there may not be a fraction at all. You may be dealing in whole seconds. Like for astrophotography, you need to allow a ton of light into the camera. So you are doing what is called a long exposure, which is many seconds long. Your shutter speed may be 15 seconds or more. And now for the other thing that shutter speed controls. Shutter speed also controls how quickly you are capturing the image, which has implications for how crisp or how blurry your subject appears. If you choose a slower shutter speed, you can experience blur in your image from either your hand moving slightly or your subject moving slightly. There is a general rule of thumb that if you are shooting handheld, meaning you're holding your camera, your shutter speed should be the inverse of your focal length. So if I'm using a 35mm lens, my shutter speed should be at least 1/35th of a second. That being said, that can be helped by a feature that you may have on your camera or lens, image stabilization. Some lenses have image stabilization built in, and some camera bodies have image stabilization right on the sensor. That stabilization helps to prevent blur in your image from your own movement. Image stabilization is incredibly helpful when using telephoto lenses in particular because they are more difficult to hold completely still. This is one reason why some photographers use tripods to prevent motion blur from your own motion as a photographer. If you want to use a slower shutter speed than the inverse of your focal length, maybe you don't have image stabilization or it just isn't enough. Or even if you are using a fast enough shutter speed to stop any blur from your own slight movement, or you have image stabilization, or you're using a tripod so your camera is completely still, your subject might move a bit, or even a lot. And neither image stabilization nor a tripod will help with that. So you'll need to consider how much your subject is moving when choosing a shutter speed. If you are taking a portrait, maybe 1/250th will do. But if you're attempting to capture a bird in flight or sports, you may be looking at 1/500th, 1/1000th, or more. Now, how to adjust shutter speed on your camera? As with Aperture, to adjust shutter speed, you will either use a button or a dial or a combination of the two. On this camera, I have two dials, one on the front and one on the back. For me, the dial on the back changes the shutter speed, and as I turn it, I can see the shutter speed changing in this top window. On this camera, I have one dial on the top of the camera, and all I have to do is turn it to see the shutter speed number change on the back of the camera. Moving on to this mirrorless camera, I have a rocker switch on the back that I push up or down to adjust shutter speed. Again, I'm seeing it on this screen on the back of my camera. And for this point and shoot camera, I press this button on the back of the camera to see on this rear screen that I'm going to change shutter speed, then turn this wheel to see the number changing. Of course, if none of those methods were right for your camera, check with your specific camera's manual. It's not always the most fun to go through your manual, but those manuals have an immense amount of information in them. If you download the PDF version onto your computer, you'll even be able to search for certain terms like aperture or shutter speed. Okay, now that you have an understanding of aperture and shutter speed, let's move on to the last component of exposure, ISO.